Black reporter pulled a stranger up for a dance to save his life. He was Korea's deadliest mafia boss. Tammy's hand remained locked on Park Hyun-woo's shoulder, her palm damp against the expensive wool of his suit as they moved in a stiff, mechanical circle. Every second felt like a jagged blade dragging across stone. The jazz music, once a sophisticated backdrop to the gala's opulence, now sounded like a funeral dirge playing at double speed. She could feel the weight of 100 elite eyes on them, curious, judgmental, and confused by the sight of the untouchable CEO of Han Holdings being led by a woman they didn't recognize. Park Hyun-woo's gaze never left hers. It was a dark, analytical vacuum that seemed to strip away her emerald silk gown and her reporter's persona, searching for the hidden gear driving her desperation. "You have 4 minutes left," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the clink of crystal and the low hum of high society gossip. "You talk as if you can see the wind," Park Hyun-woo replied, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that she felt more than heard. He didn't pull away, but his body was a coiled spring, his muscles tight with a deep-seated hatred for the unpredictability she had thrust upon him. He was a man who lived by calculations, and Tammy Brooks was the first variable he couldn't solve. Tammy didn't blink. She couldn't afford to. She was hyper-observant, her eyes darting past his sharp jawline to scan the VIP section behind him. Seat number 8 sat empty, a silent, velvet-lined death trap. She thought of the 2 men she'd heard near the service entrance. The harsh, rapid-fire Italian, the clinical way they discussed numero auto, and the cold click of a remote trigger being tested. They had looked at her as if she were furniture, a mere decoration in her fusion gown, never imagining that the outsider understood every word of their murderous intent. The air in the ballroom suddenly felt heavy, charged with a static tension that made the hair on her arms stand up. The timer in her head hit 0. The explosion wasn't a roar. It was a sharp, electrical crack that shattered the refined atmosphere like a hammer to a mirror. A plume of acrid smoke and blue-white sparks erupted from the center of the VIP lounge, right where Park Hyun-woo's head would have been resting seconds ago. The velvet of seat 8 disintegrated into charred ribbons, and the smell of ozone and burning chemicals instantly replaced the scent of expensive perfume. For a heartbeat, the room was paralyzed by a deafening silence. Then, the screams began. The transition from elegance to anarchy was instantaneous. Socialites tripped over their gowns, and designer shoes clattered frantically against the marble as the crowd surged toward the exits. Park Hyun-woo didn't scream. He didn't even flinch. As the smoke curled toward the gold-leafed ceiling, he simply stopped dancing and looked at the smoldering wreckage of his chair. His grip on Tammy's waist changed. It was no longer a reluctant formality, it was a claim. He spun her around, shielding her body with his own as his personal security team materialized from the shadows, their hands already moving toward the concealed weapons beneath their jackets. The coldness in his eyes had transformed into something far more terrifying, a focused, lethal clarity. He looked down at Tammy, his analytical mind already re-evaluating everything he thought he knew about the woman in emerald silk. She was shaking, the adrenaline finally crashing through her system, but she didn't look away. She had risked her life for a man she was supposed to be investigating, a man whose reputation as Korea's deadliest boss made her blood run cold. "How?" Park Hyun-woo asked, the single word cutting through the chaos of the fleeing guests. "How did a stranger know what my own shadow didn't?" Tammy swallowed hard, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She looked at the smoke, then back at the man who now held her as if she were the most valuable asset in the room. The outsider was no longer invisible. She had interrupted fate, and in doing so, she had tied her life to the most dangerous man in Seoul. "I heard them," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "And I couldn't just watch you die." Park Hyun-woo didn't respond with words. He simply signaled to his lead bodyguard, a silent command that meant Tammy was not to leave his sight. The hunt for the assassins was beginning, but for Park Hyun-woo, the biggest mystery was standing right in front of him. For hours before Tammy Brooks' fingers would bruise the expensive wool of a mafia boss's sleeve, she was standing in the humid, dimly lit service corridor of the Seoul Grand Ballroom, feeling entirely like the ghost her career had become, The weight of the emerald fusion gown was a physical reminder of the stakes. It wasn't just a dress, it was a disguise bought with her last 2 months of savings, a desperate bid to move from the lifestyle and culture desk to the hard-hitting investigative journalism she had moved to Korea for. In the high-stakes world of Seoul's elite, Tammy was used to being the only person in the room who didn't officially exist. As a black woman in a space dominated by hereditary wealth and rigid corporate hierarchies, she had learned to weaponize her outsider status. She was the one who held the door open and was thanked with a blank stare, the one who stood by the buffet and was assumed to be part of the catering staff. For months, she had been ignored, sidelined, and treated as a decorative afterthought. But Tammy didn't mind the invisibility anymore, it was her greatest asset. It gave her a front-row seat to the secrets the powerful only whispered when they thought no one worth noting was listening. The afternoon had started with the soul-crushing routine of a reporter chasing crumbs. She had spent hours trying to land a quote from a minor official, only to be brushed off with a polite, dismissive bow. Frustrated and needing a moment of silence away from the cloying scent of lilies and expensive cologne, she had slipped through a set of heavy velvet curtains into the backstage maze of the gala. The corridor was a stark contrast to the glittering ballroom, all exposed pipes, concrete, and the frantic energy of technicians. It was here, tucked into a narrow alcove behind a stack of equipment crates, that Tammy's world shifted. At first, it was just a low hum of voices. Then, the cadence hit her. It was a language that felt like a sun-drenched memory from her childhood, Italian. Her summers spent in the winding, dusty streets of Rome with her grandmother hadn't just given her a love for the culture, they had given her a fluency that was now a secret weapon. "Il telecomando è pronto?" one voice asked, a sharp, clinical rasp. "Is the remote ready?" Tammy froze, her breath catching in her throat. She pressed her back against the cool concrete, her heart beginning a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. "See," a second voice replied, smoother and deeper. "Seduta auto. Quando il VIP sied, abbiamo una finestra di 7 minuti prima che la folla diventi troppo densa per un'usa di pulita. Seat 8. When the VIP sits, we have a 7-minute window before the crowd becomes too dense for a clean exit." Tammy's mind raced. Seat 8. She had memorized the floor plan of the gala weeks ago in hopes of identifying the most influential targets for her story. Seat 8 was the cornerstone of the VIP section, reserved for the man the business world called the icicle of Seoul and the underworld called the deadliest shadow, Park Hyun-woo. The two men stepped into view for a fleeting second, European, dressed in the anonymous black suits of security personnel. They were holding a tablet that glowed with a schematic of a chair. They weren't just security, they were the architects of a public execution. They spoke of numero auto as if he were a malfunctioning piece of machinery to be discarded, their tone devoid of heat or hesitation. Tammy's hyper-observant nature, the trait that usually only served to help her catch typos in press releases, suddenly began connecting dots with terrifying speed. She saw the way they checked their watches, the way one man adjusted a small device on his belt that didn't look like a standard radio. They weren't just planning a murder, they were counting down. A sudden crash of equipment from further down the hall made the men vanish into the shadows, but the air remained charged with their intent. Tammy stayed in the alcove long after they were gone, her hands trembling as she smoothed the emerald silk of her gown. She had the break she had been praying for, a story that would make her name in every newsroom from Seoul to New York. But as she looked at her reflection in a nearby equipment case, she didn't see a reporter. She saw a woman who was the only person in the entire building who could hear the ticking of a clock no one else knew existed. The moral courage that had always been her quiet burden flared to life. She couldn't call the police. By the time they cleared the layers of gala security, it would be too late. She couldn't tell the gala staff, they would see a striking outsider and assume she was a delusional guest or a disgruntled worker. She had 4 hours. 4 hours to navigate the elite social minefield, bypass Park Hyun-woo's wall of stone-faced guards, and convince a man who trusted no one to bet his life on a stranger. Tammy took a deep breath, adjusted her sleek ponytail, and stepped back into the light of the ballroom. The invisibility she had hated was over. Tonight, she was going to be the only person Park Hyun-woo would ever truly see. The acrid scent of ozone and charred velvet hung heavy in the air, a physical manifestation of the life that had almost ended. Around them, the grand ballroom was a kaleidoscope of panic, but within the small radius of Park Hyun-woo's presence, the world was unnervingly still. He didn't look like a man who had just narrowly escaped an assassination, he looked like a predator who had just discovered a new, fascinating species of prey. His hand, which had been resting on Tammy's waist with a calculated, distant pressure, now tightened for a fraction of a second before he pulled away. The stillness of his posture was terrifying, a sharp jawline set in stone as he watched the smoke curl from the ruins of Seat 8. Tammy Brooks stood frozen, her chest heaving beneath the weight of her emerald fusion gown. The adrenaline that had propelled her onto the dance floor was receding, leaving her limbs feeling like lead and her mind a static-filled mess. She was hyper-aware of the eyes on her. Not the judging elite eyes from before, but the cold, scanning gazes of the security team that had converged on them. They moved with a silent, lethal efficiency, forming a human barrier between the VIP and the rest of the world. Hyun-woo finally turned his gaze back to her. The analytical vacancy in his eyes had been replaced by a piercing, dark intensity that felt like a physical weight. He reached into the inner pocket of his impeccably tailored black suit, his movements slow and deliberate. Tammy's instinct-driven mind screamed at her to run, but her feet wouldn't move. He produced a card, thick, matte black, with nothing but a name and a single embossed number in gold. No company title, no address. Just the name, Park Hyun-woo. "You are a very observant woman, Tammy Brooks," he said, his voice a low, melodic threat. He didn't ask how he knew her name, a man like him didn't need to ask. He simply pressed the card into her palm. His fingers were cold, the contact brief but searing. "And observation is a dangerous hobby in this city. You've disrupted a very carefully laid plan tonight. That makes you an asset to me, and a target for others." Before she could find her voice to protest or ask for an explanation, he was already moving. He didn't leave, he retreated into the shadows of his own power. His security detail closed ranks, a wall of black suits that swallowed him whole as they moved toward a private service exit. Tammy was left standing in the middle of a dissipating cloud of smoke, the matte black card clutched so tightly in her hand that the gold embossing bit into her skin. She didn't stay to watch the police arrive. Her reporter's instinct, usually so hungry for the story, was currently being drowned out by a raw, primal need for survival. She slipped through the side exit she had used hours earlier, the humid soul night air hitting her face like a physical blow. Her mind was a whirlpool of what-ifs and the lingering, dangerous echo of his voice. It wasn't until she was safely locked inside her cramped, third-floor apartment in AMBW that she allowed herself to breathe. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of her bed, the city lights reflecting off the deep emerald silk of her gown, and pulled out her laptop. Her fingers trembled as she typed the name into the search bar, Park Hyun-woo. The results didn't just populate. They exploded across the screen. The public profile was polished to a mirror finish: CEO of Han Holdings, philanthropist, visionary of the new Seoul skyline. There were photos of him at ribbon cuttings, shaking hands with ministers, always with that same controlled, minimalist expression. But Tammy knew how to look past the first page of Google. She knew how to dig into the forums, the archived police reports that never made it to trial, and the hushed whispers of the digital underground. The deeper she clicked, the colder the room seemed to become. The business card of blood wasn't just a metaphor. Behind the corporate skyscrapers and the charity galas lay a shadow empire that spanned the entire peninsula. The name Hyun-woo was whispered in connection to the dismantling of 3 rival syndicates in a single night. He was the icicle, the man who operated by a code so rigid and violent that even the most seasoned prosecutors looked the other way. He wasn't just a powerful businessman, he was the apex predator of the Korean underworld. Tammy stared at the screen, a fragment of her childhood summer in Rome flickering through her mind, the way her grandmother had warned her about the beautiful, still waters of the Mediterranean. The ones that don't ripple are the ones that drown you, she had said. She looked down at the black card resting on her keyboard. She hadn't just saved a CEO. She had interrupted the fate of Korea's deadliest boss. And as her phone began to vibrate with a blocked caller ID, she realized the break she had been looking for in her career might just be the one that ended her life. The outsider was no longer invisible, she was right in the center of the icicle's gaze. The glow of Tammy's laptop was the only light in her Mapogu apartment, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls as she stared at the digital trail of Park Hyun-woo. Every article she uncovered, every whispered rumor of a dual identity between a legitimate CEO and a merciless crime lord, made the air in the room feel thinner. She felt as though she had reached into a dark hole expecting to find a story and instead had closed her hand around a live wire. Her fingers, still marked with the faint indentation of the black card he had pressed into her palm, hovered over the keyboard. She was a reporter who had spent years wishing to be noticed by the elite, but now that she was in the center of the deadliest man in Korea's gaze, she felt a soul-deep longing for her former invisibility. The silence of the apartment was absolute, yet it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the holding of a collective breath. Tammy's hyper-observant mind, usually her greatest tool, was now her tormentor. Every creak of the floorboards or distant hum of a passing car felt like a countdown. She tried to tell herself she was overreacting, that she was just a witness, a stranger who had intervened. But Hyun-woo's words echoed in her mind, "You've disrupted a very carefully laid plan." The vibration of her phone against the wooden desk sounded like a gunshot. Tammy flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. She looked down. The screen displayed no name, no location, only a string of zeros that signaled a blocked, encrypted ID. Her first instinct was to let it go to voicemail, but her fingers acted on the instinct-driven impulse that defined her. She answered. She didn't speak. She held the phone to her ear, her breath shallow, listening to the hollow static on the other end. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then, a voice emerged, not the cold, melodic rasp of Park Hyun-woo, but something far more clinical and devoid of humanity. It was the same Italian-accented cadence she had heard in the service corridor, but this time, the man spoke in perfect, unaccented English, his tone chillingly conversational. "You have a very striking presence, Tammy Brooks," the voice said. The emerald silk was an inspired choice. It made you very easy to track. Tammy's grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. A cold sweat broke out along her hairline. They knew her name. They had seen her. "Who is this?" She whispered, her voice cracking despite her attempts at subtle confidence. "It doesn't matter who I am," the voice replied, and she could almost hear the thin, cruel smile behind the words. "What matters is the 7 minutes you stole. Those minutes belong to my employer, Jang Min-suk. You were supposed to be a ghost, a pretty decoration for a boring gala. Instead, you chose to be a hero." The mention of Jang Min-suk made Tammy's blood turn to ice. In her research over the last hour, that name had appeared as the shadow to Hyun-woo's light, the rival, the usurper, the man whose greed was only matched by his brutality. She realized then that the Italian assassins weren't just random mercenaries, they were the precision tools of a corporate and criminal war. "I don't know what you're talking about," Tammy lied, her outsider mentality kicking into survival mode. "I just wanted a dance with a handsome man." The man on the other end let out a soft, dry chuckle that held no humor. "A brave lie. But you didn't just dance, Tammy. You disrupted fate. You saved a man who was marked for deletion, and in doing so, you marked yourself. You shouldn't have danced, Tammy. You should have stayed invisible." "Is that a threat?" she asked, her moral courage flare-up overriding her fear for a brief, defiant second. "It is an observation of reality," the voice said, dropping into a lower, more lethal register. "Park Hyun-woo protects his assets, but he cannot protect a memory. By the time the sun rises over Seoul, you will realize that some stories aren't worth the byline. Enjoy the view from your window, Tammy. It's the last one you'll see in peace." The line went dead with a final, hollow click. Tammy stood up so abruptly her chair screeched against the floor. She rushed to the window, peering through the slats of her blinds at the street below. The neon signs of the Maplegu district blurred into streaks of pink and blue. At the far end of the block, a black sedan sat idling, its headlights extinguished, like a shark waiting in the dark water. She wasn't safe. The reporter who had spent months being overlooked was now the most hunted witness in the city. She looked at the matte black card on her desk, the gold name Park Hyun-woo gleaming in the dark. He was her only lead, and potentially her only shield. She grabbed her coat, the emerald gown still rustling beneath it, and realized the business card of blood was no longer just a souvenir of a chaotic night. It was her only chance to survive the shadow on the phone. The chilling finality of the phone call lingered. Ed in Tammy's apartment long after the line went dead, a cold residue that no amount of morning light could scrub away. By noon the next day, the brave reporter headlines were already saturating the local news, featuring grainy footage of an emerald blur pulling a tycoon from a blast zone. Tammy, however, was not celebrating. She was operating on a cocktail of caffeine and terror, her hyper-observant mind now a curse that turned every passing pedestrian into a potential threat. She had spent the morning attempting to ground herself in the familiar, returning to a follow-up story regarding a logistics warehouse in Jumchungu. It was a mundane task, investigating a series of suspicious shipping manifests she'd discovered weeks ago, but now, every discrepancy in the paperwork felt like a breadcrumb leading back to the men who had promised her the view from her window would be her last. The warehouse was a cavernous, steel-ribbed cathedral of corrugated metal and dust-filtered sunlight. The air smelled of diesel and old cardboard. Tammy moved deep into the stacks of shipping containers, her recorder in hand, trying to focus on the task. But the stillness was wrong. The usual rhythmic clatter of forklifts was absent, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt intentional. Her instinct-driven internal alarm began to wail just as the light from the main loading bay was cut off. Two figures stepped from behind a wall of crates, their movements fluid and predatory. They weren't wearing the anonymous black suits of the gala, they were dressed in rugged, practical gear, but Tammy recognized the stillness, the same lethal calm she had seen in the service corridor. "You really should have stayed in your apartment, Tammy," one of them said, his voice echoing with a hollow, metallic ring. "It would have been much cleaner." Tammy didn't wait for a second sentence. She spun on her heel and bolted toward the back of the facility, her high-fashion heels clattering uselessly against the concrete until she kicked them off, running barefoot toward the labyrinth of the storage rooms. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was an outsider who had survived by being overlooked, and now she needed to use that invisibility to disappear into the bowels of the building. She lunged into a narrow storage room filled with industrial cleaning supplies and heavy shelving. The door didn't have a lock. Looking around with wide, calculating eyes, she grabbed a heavy canister of pressurized floor wax and a length of industrial wire. Her mind, fueled by moral courage and the raw need to survive, worked with a clarity she hadn't known she possessed. She rigged the wire across the door frame, anchoring it to an unstable stack of metal pallets, and positioned the canister near a ventilation grate. As the heavy footsteps of the hitmen reached the door, Tammy scrambled into the narrow crawlspace of the ventilation shaft. The door burst open, and the lead man tripped over the wire, sending the stack of pallets crashing down in a deafening roar of grinding metal. In the confusion, Tammy kicked the release valve on the canister, filling the small room with a blinding, chemical fog. She crawled through the ductwork, her deep brown skin smudged with soot, her lungs burning. She dropped out of a vent on the exterior wall of the warehouse just as the screech of tires tore through the air. A fleet of 4 matte black SUVs roared into the gravel lot, sliding into a precise, defensive formation. The doors flew open with synchronized violence. These weren't the assassins, these were the controlled urgency of Park Hyun-woo's private army. From the center vehicle, Hyun-woo stepped out, his tailored suit a sharp, dark contrast to the industrial decay around him. He didn't look worried, he looked like a man who was about to collect an asset. His eyes locked onto Tammy, taking in her disheveled state and the fierce, predatory light still burning in her almond-shaped eyes. He walked toward her, the gravel crunching beneath his expensive shoes. "I told you," he said, his voice a low, cool anchor in the chaos. "Observation is a dangerous hobby. It's time to move you to a fortress." The transition from the industrial decay of the warehouse to the interior of the black SUV was a blur of motion and muted sound. Tammy sat in the plush leather seat, her breath still coming in ragged hitches, her bare feet tucked beneath the torn hem of her emerald gown. Outside the tinted glass, Seoul flickered by, a smear of neon and rain-slicked pavement, but inside, the atmosphere was thick with the silent, heavy power of Park Hyun-woo. He didn't speak as the convoy navigated the city with predatory precision, bypassing the gridlock through routes that didn't seem to exist on any map. They finally pulled into a private subterranean garage beneath a towering monolith of glass and steel on the edge of the Han River. This was the Glass Fortress, a structure that served as both Hyun-woo's corporate headquarters and his personal sanctuary. As the elevator ascended in a smooth, silent rush, Tammy Brooks caught her reflection in the polished chrome doors. The high-fashion ponytail was frayed, her deep brown skin was smudged with soot from the warehouse vent, and her almond-shaped eyes were wide with a raw, vibrating fear she could no longer suppress. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling penthouse that redefined the concept of minimalist luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying, panoramic view of the river, but the glass was reinforced to withstand a siege. The air was filtered, cool, and carried the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood, Hyun-woo's scent. "You can wash in there," Hyun-woo said, gesturing toward a door of frosted glass. "There are clothes. Functional ones." Tammy stepped into the bathroom, a cavern of white marble and high-tech fixtures. It was only when she caught sight of herself in the full-length mirror that the adrenaline finally evaporated, leaving a hollow, crushing void in its place. She began to peel off the emerald silk gown, the dress that was supposed to be her ticket to a career break, now a ruined rag smelling of smoke and floor wax. As the dress hit the floor, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. She turned on the shower, the water scaldingly hot, and leaned her forehead against the cool marble tile. The reality of the last 24 hours crashed over her like a physical weight. She wasn't just a reporter anymore, she was a witness to a failed execution ordered by Jang Min-suk, a man who had already proven he could find her in a crowded ballroom and a locked warehouse. She was trapped in the orbit of the most dangerous man in Korea, protected only by his whim. When she finally emerged, dressed in a simple black silk robe provided for her, she found Hyun-woo standing by the window, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand. The dual identity she had researched felt palpable here. He looked like a CEO, but he stood with the stillness of a man who lived with a permanent target on his back. Tammy walked toward him, her footsteps silent on the thick rugs. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice a fragile whisper. "I'm an outsider. A glitch. Why not just give me a plane ticket and send me back to Rome?" Hyun-woo turned, his analytical eyes softening for the briefest of moments as he took in her vulnerability. "Because the men who want you dead don't care about borders, Tammy. They care about silence." He stepped closer, his presence a dark, protective anchor. "And because you are the only person who has ever looked at me and seen a life worth saving, rather than an asset to be managed." Tammy looked out at the city lights, realizing with a jolt of terror that the glass fortress wasn't just keeping the world out, it was holding her in. She had disrupted fate, and now she was part of its machinery. The quiet frustration that usually fueled her bold decisions was gone, replaced by the chilling realization that she was no longer just observing the story, she was the heart of it. The panoramic view of the Han River from the glass fortress was a glittering tapestry of gold and deep indigo, but inside the penthouse, the air was heavy with things left unsaid. Tammy stood near the floor-to-ceiling glass, her fingers tracing the hem of the black silk robe. She felt like a different person than the woman who had walked into the gala in emerald silk just 24 hours ago. Behind her, she heard the soft clink of ice against glass. Park Hyun-woo had not moved from his position by the bar, his silhouette sharp and unyielding against the city lights. "You're wondering if you traded one cage for another," Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Tammy turned, her damp curls catching the amber light of the room. I'm wondering if I saved a man only to lose myself in his war. I've read the reports, Hyun-woo. I know what they call you. I know about the icicle and the dismantled syndicates. Hyun-woo walked toward her, his movements stripped of the corporate artifice he wore in public. He stopped just outside her personal space, the scent of sandalwood and expensive whiskey surrounding her. He didn't look like a saint, and he didn't pretend to be one. There was a darkness in his gaze that spoke of hard decisions and a history written in scars. The reports aren't wrong, but they are incomplete, he began, his tone devoid of apology. This city is built on foundations of greed. Men like Jang Min-suk don't just want profit, they want a vacuum where no one can challenge them. They rule through fear because it's the only currency they understand. I rule through a code. A code that involves explosions at galas? Tammy asked, her reporter skepticism flickering through her exhaustion. A code that dictates loyalty is the only absolute, he countered, his eyes locking onto hers with a sudden, searing intensity. I am not a hero, Tammy. I have done things that would keep a woman like you awake for a lifetime. But I have never struck a hand that wasn't already raised against me, and I have never let a debt go unpaid. You risked everything, your career, your safety, your very life, to save a man you were supposed to be exposing. That kind of bravery is a rare glitch in this world. It's a language I haven't heard in a long time. He set his glass down on a marble side table, the sound final and sharp. Jang Min-suk thinks he can use you to get to me. He thinks he can turn your courage into a liability. He is mistaken. By the time the sun rises tomorrow, he will realize that targeting you was the last mistake he will ever make. You're going to kill him, Tammy whispered, the reality of the underworld war sinking in. I am going to end him, Hyun-woo corrected, the distinction chilling in its precision. I will dismantle his assets, strip him of his shadow empire, and leave him with nothing but the silence he tried to impose on you. In my world, we don't just survive our enemies. We erase the possibility of them ever returning. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he pulled it back, a rare moment of hesitation from a man who lived by calculations. You are under my protection now, Tammy. Not because you are an asset to be managed, but because you are the only truth I've encountered in years. Sleep. My men are at every door, and my word is at every border. Jang Min-suk's time is over. Yours is just beginning. Tammy watched him walk away toward his private office, the door closing with a heavy, mechanical thud. She looked back at the river, feeling the weight of the business card of blood in her pocket. She had come to Seoul to find a story, but she had found a guardian who was more terrifying than the monsters he protected her from. The midnight confession hadn't made her feel safer, but it had made her certain of one thing. The outsider was no longer invisible, and the man who held the city in his hand was now holding her life as his highest priority. The transition from the intimacy of the midnight confession to the cold, tactical atmosphere of the war room was seamless and jarring. Park Hyun-woo had traded his whiskey glass for a secure terminal, the screens casting a rhythmic, flickering blue light across his features. Tammy watched from the periphery, wrapped in the black silk robe that felt like both a shroud and a shield. She was hyper-observant of the way the air in the glass fortress had shifted from protective to predatory. The icicle was no longer just a man, he was the center of a web that reached into every corner of Seoul, and tonight, he was pulling the strands. Hyun-woo didn't look up as he spoke into an encrypted line. Is the perimeter set, detective? The voice on the other end was rough, grounded in a weariness that only decades on the force could produce. It was Jang Min-suk, a childhood friend who had risen through the ranks of the Seoul Metropolitan Police while Hyun-woo had built his shadow empire. They were two sides of the same coin, one operating in the light of the law, the other in the gray of the code. We have the warrants for the logistics warehouses in Jumchung-gu, Min-suk replied. But Hyun-woo, if you move on the docks before my boys get there, I can't protect you from the internal affairs fallout. You handle the paper trail, Min-suk, Hyun-woo said, his voice a low, lethal anchor. I'll handle the silence. Kim Sung-ho's network is a parasite, It needs to be cut out from the bone, not just the skin. The silent takedown began not with a roar, but with a series of digital and physical erasures. Tammy watched the monitors as Hyun-woo coordinated a two-pronged assault. Legally, the police were raiding Sung-ho's legitimate fronts, freezing accounts and seizing manifests that Tammy herself had begun to uncover at the warehouse. Illegally, Hyun-woo's private teams were moving through the city with the controlled urgency of ghosts. They weren't there to kill, they were there to dismantle. They disabled communication hubs, intercepted encrypted shipments, and neutralized Sung-ho's personal security with a clinical efficiency that left no room for retaliation. Every few minutes, a new status update flashed across the screen in red: Target Alpha, secured. Asset Beta, liquidated. Communications, dark. Hyun-woo stood at the center of the chaos, a minimalist conductor of a violent symphony. He wasn't just ending a rival, he was erasing a legacy. As the night wore on, Tammy realized the extent of the dual identity she had been investigating. Hyun-woo and Min-suk were a precision instrument, the law providing the justification, and the code providing the execution. The hitmen from the warehouse? Tammy asked, her voice trembling but certain. They are already in custody, Hyun-woo said, finally turning to look at her. They will be talking to the prosecutor by dawn. Kim Sung-ho's shadow is shrinking, Tammy. He wanted a war, but he forgot that I own the map. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the Han River, the red alerts on the monitors had all turned to a steady, silent green. Kim Sung-ho's empire, which had seemed so impenetrable just hours ago, had been reduced to a pile of legal documents and empty warehouses. The man who had promised Tammy her last peaceful view was now the one looking at the walls of a cell or the end of a very short road. Hyun-woo walked over to the window, the blue light of the screens finally fading. He looked tired, the icicle persona cracking just enough to show the man who had fought for his friend's safety. It's done, he said. The silence is back. Tammy looked at him, the weight of the night finally sinking in. She had witnessed the dismantling of a monster by a man who was, in his own way, just as terrifying. The silent takedown was over, but the story was just beginning. The first golden rays of dawn hit the glass of the penthouse, but the digital world had already been awake and screaming for hours. While Tammy had watched the silent, surgical dismantling of a criminal network from the safety of the glass fortress, a different kind of machinery had been humming in the background. Park Hyun-woo's public relations team, a group of high-stakes architects who specialized in narrative control, had been working with the same, controlled urgency as his tactical teams. By 6 a.m., the story of the gala explosion had been meticulously reshaped. Tammy sat at the minimalist breakfast bar, a tablet in her hands. The headlines were no longer about a security breach or a near assassination, they were about her. The Emerald Savior. Foreign reporter thwarts gala tragedy, one major news outlet blared. Another featured a high-resolution still from the ballroom's security footage, capturing the exact moment Tammy had reached for Hyun-woo's hand. In the image, she didn't look like a struggling outsider, she looked like a woman of moral courage and instinct-driven clarity. The narrative was perfect. A brilliant, observant reporter from the international desk had noticed the suspicious behavior of the waitstaff and used a dance to pull the CEO of Han Holdings out of the blast zone. You're a star, Tammy, Hyun-woo said, stepping into the kitchen. He had changed into a fresh suit, looking every bit the legitimate, untouchable billionaire once again. The icicle had retreated behind a mask of corporate elegance. My team has ensured that every major network in Seoul, and several in New York, is calling your editor. You aren't just a ghost anymore. You are the most valuable journalist in the city. Tammy felt a dizzying surge of conflicting emotions. The career break she had been praying for was finally here, delivered on a silver platter by the man she had saved. Her phone, finally returned to her by his security team, was vibrating almost non-stop with notifications. Messages from her editor, who had previously ignored her pitches, were now frantic with praise and demands for an exclusive first-person account. "Is this the code too?" she asked, her almond-shaped eyes searching his for a sign of the man who had shared a midnight confession. "Turning a near-death experience into a PR victory?" "It's about control," Hyun-woo replied, his voice a low, cool anchor. "In this city, if you don't write your own story, someone else will write it for you. You gave me my life. The least I can do is give you the platform you've earned." As the day progressed, the scandal of the explosion was completely eclipsed by Tammy's star turn. By noon, she was being whisked away in one of Hyun-woo's SUVs to her newsroom, not as a lifestyle reporter returning to her desk, but as a hero. The lobby was filled with cameras, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one holding the microphone, she was the one it was being pointed at. The transition from being the invisible outsider to the brave reporter was instantaneous and total. Her desk was covered in flowers, and her boss, a man who once couldn't remember her name, was now offering her a permanent position on the investigative team. The shipping manifests she had been digging into at the warehouse were no longer just crumbs, they were the foundation of a lead story that the entire country was now watching. Tammy walked through the office, her head held high, the subtle confidence she had practiced for months now a permanent part of her posture. She knew the danger wasn't entirely gone, Jang Min-suk's network was dismantled, but the world they inhabited was one where shadows always lingered. Yet, as she sat down to write her first headline for the front page, she looked at the matte black card still tucked in her bag. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had birthed her own. The reporter who had survived by being overlooked was gone. In her place stood a woman who had danced with the deadliest man in Korea and walked away with the world in her hand. The transition from the frantic neon pulse of Seoul to the timeless, golden light of Paris had happened with a velocity that still made Tammy's head spin if she thought about it too long. 6 months after the night of the Emerald Savior, the woman who had once navigated the service corridors of the Seoul Grand Ballroom as an invisible ghost was now the keynote speaker at the International Press Freedom Summit. As she stood on the balcony of her hotel overlooking the Place de la Concorde, the cool Parisian air carried the scent of rain and expensive espresso, a sharp, sophisticated contrast to the ozone and charred velvet that had haunted her dreams for weeks after the gala. Tammy Brooks adjusted the lapel of her tailored cream blazer, her deep brown skin glowing against the light. She was no longer just a reporter chasing crumbs of lifestyle stories, she was an international icon, a symbol of moral courage in an industry often criticized for its complacency. Her investigation into Jang Min-suk's logistics network, bolstered by the silent takedown coordinated by Park Hyun-woo and his childhood friend in the police, had won her every major award in journalism. The business card of blood she had once clutched in a dark apartment was now a framed piece of history in her New York office, a reminder of the night the outsider finally broke through the glass. The price of fame had been high, paparazzi in Mapo-gu, endless talk show invitations, and the loss of her cherished anonymity, but as she watched the sun set over the Eiffel Tower, Tammy realized the trade-off was a victory she hadn't known she was allowed to claim. She was a woman who had survived the deadliest man in Korea, and in doing so, she had learned that her outsider status wasn't a weakness, it was a vantage point that allowed her to see the truth before anyone else. A notification chimed on her phone, a private, encrypted message that bypassed the filters of her new, high-powered PR team. There was no name, only a familiar string of zeros and a single attachment, a digital copy of a Parisian newspaper. The front page featured her photo with the headline "L'icône du courage." Below it, a short message was written in the same low, melodic cadence she could still feel vibrating in the back of her mind. "The world looks good on you, Tammy. You were always meant for the stage, not the shadows." Tammy smiled, a genuine, subtle confidence lighting up her face. She knew Park Hyun-woo was likely watching from a fortress of his own, his dual identity still intact, his code still the law of his shadow empire. She had saved his life that night on the dance floor, pulling him away from a seat that was meant to be his coffin, but she realized now that the debt had been paid 10 times over. He hadn't just given her protection or a career break, he had given her the world to conquer. He had seen the glitch in her, the refusal to be a bystander, and had built a platform where that glitch could become a revolution. She stepped back inside the suite to prepare for the evening ceremony, her reflection in the gilded mirror no longer showing a trembling reporter in a ruined emerald gown. It showed a woman who had danced with a monster and walked away with her soul intact and her voice amplified to a roar. The story that had begun with a 7-minute warning in Seoul had reached its crescendo on the Paris stage. Tammy Brooks was no longer invisible, and the world was finally listening to every word she had to say. The evening air in Paris was a cooling balm as Tammy stepped out of the summit venue, the echoes of the standing ovation still ringing in her ears. She had just finished her final address, a powerful call for transparency that had moved the room of seasoned journalists to a rare, collective silence. As she moved toward the waiting car, a flash of movement in the shadow of a nearby limestone archway caught her hyper-observant eye. A man was leaning against the stone, his silhouette familiar even in the dimming light of the Rue de Rivoli. He wasn't wearing the anonymous black suit of a CEO or the tactical gear of a warlord. He was dressed in a simple, perfectly cut charcoal overcoat that made him blend into the Parisian elegance. Park Hyun-woo pushed off the wall as she approached, the icicle persona replaced by a quiet, grounded presence that felt intensely personal. "You've become quite the orator, Tammy," he said, his voice a low, melodic anchor in the bustling city noise. Tammy stopped, her pulse jumping not from fear, but from the sudden gravity of his presence. "You traveled halfway across the world to hear a speech you probably could have streamed on your plane, Hyun-woo?" "I didn't come for the speech," he replied, stepping into the light. His eyes, once so analytical and distant, were now focused on her with a raw, unshielded honesty. "I came to see if the woman I protected still recognized the man who owes her his life." They began to walk toward the Seine, the distance between them filled with the weight of the months they had spent apart. Tammy told him of the Paris stage. The whirlwind of awards, the relentless pursuit of the truth, and the strange loneliness that came with being an international icon. Hyun-woo spoke of the aftermath in Seoul, the silent takedown having left a vacuum he was still meticulously filling, but with a new code that prioritized the safety of those who, like her, were brave enough to be glitches in the system. "I realized something on the flight over," Hyun-woo said as they reached the Pont Neuf, looking out over the water where the lights of the city danced like the emerald silk of her ruined gown. "I gave you the world to conquer, Tammy. But in doing so, I made it impossible for me to be a part of it." Tammy turned to him, her almond-shaped eyes softening. "You think you're still a monster in a glass fortress?" "I think I am a man who lives in the shadows," he said, his hand resting on the stone railing next to hers. "And you are a woman who has become the light. Those two things usually cancel each other out." "Usually," Tammy agreed, her voice of subtle confidence that challenged his logic. "But we've already disrupted fate once, haven't we? 7 minutes was all it took to change the map of Seoul. I think we can handle a few more minutes in Paris." She reached out and took his hand, her deep brown skin a striking contrast to his pale, cool fingers. The contact was no longer a desperate plea for a dance or a frantic grab for survival, it was a choice. For the first time, the dual identity of the Mafia boss and the brave reporter faded away, leaving only two people standing on a bridge in a city that didn't know their secrets. "So," Hyun-woo whispered, his thumb tracing the back of her hand. "What happens in the next chapter?" Tammy looked toward the Eiffel Tower, the beacon of light sweeping across the horizon. In the next chapter, the reporter stops writing other people's stories for a moment. And the man in the overcoat forgets about the code. As they walked together into the Parisian night, the business card of blood was finally a relic of the past. The story wasn't over, but the roles had changed. They were no longer the savior and the saved. They were two architects of a new, unwritten future, walking side by side into the light.